to the Gay Liberation Network here on Chicago Access Network Television. I'm your host, Andy Thayer, and with me tonight is Steve De La Rosa. Steve is a longtime activist here in the Chicago area. He is a co-chair of the DuPage County Green Party, amongst many other things. You're active in immigrant rights, I know. You've been doing a lot of great stuff against the deportations, right on the spot out there in the western burbs where a lot of folks, unfortunately, are being shipped out. So Steve has got true activist bona fides, and we're very honored to have him here on the Gay Liberation Network television program. As you saw in your opening, we're going to be discussing 50 years since the Chicago Democratic Convention in 1968, which occurred in late August of that year. It was a year of immense turmoil. Already you had had many tens of thousands, actually 3 million people eventually killed by the Vietnam War that the United States was inflicting on Southeast Asia. In addition, I believe it's 58 or 55,000 U.S. soldiers who were killed in that war of conquest. You had the civil rights movement, which after overthrowing American apartheid, the legal discrimination against black people realized that racism seemed just as entrenched as ever. And then, of course, you had the murder of Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, and streets were literally blowing up because the conditions for most people's lives, especially black people's lives, had not changed. You had a plethora of movements that were growing up. The Latino movement, you had the women's movement, you had just a year later the gay movement. But here in Chicago in 1968, you had a police riot, as it was called. But others who I've known who've been active at that time said, well, a riot implies something that's unplanned, that isn't sort of orchestrated, but actually the violence was more deliberate than that on the part of the police. Steve and I, as well as others in the Chicago Committee Against War and Racism, are going to be organizing a big demonstration on the 50th anniversary, August 25th, and we'll be getting up some graphics about that in a little bit. But Steve, with your nice 1968 shirt, why do you think this anniversary of the Chicago Democratic Convention protests is important, not just for nostalgia, but for today?
What I can say is that it is a huge opportunity to educate and to renew the struggle that we began back in the 60s. It was a tumultuous time. It was all the groups that you mentioned, all the gay liberation, the women's movement, the legalization of civic entry for people of color. Mm-hmm. That was a huge fight. When
Yes.
the Civil Rights the Civil Rights Act was signed in '65, I can remember my dad sitting me down. I was running through. I was a young kid, but he sat me down by the TV as he was watching, because he was an activist in his life. He was a steelworker for 44 years, and he was active with the Steelworkers Union and active with LULAC and Mexican American organizations from the neighborhood and Roosevelt and Taylor, where they grew, where the family put down roots after coming up from Texas. But it was all these different groups kind of being put in a blender in the midst of the war in Vietnam, in the midst of the war on the continual war on poverty. It was like a time when there were so many different struggles going on that it's very similar till now, except then it was you could get behind an organization or work with an organization for a particular issue and focus. Nowadays, it's like we're being inundated
Yeah,
With
every day it's another issue. Every day there's another insult coming out of the White House.
insult's a great word for it.
And I'd just like to note for those of you who are watching on TV, we've also got Facebook Live going here, that if you'd like to ask Steve or I a question or make a brief comment, that telephone number at the bottom of your screen, our great call screener Paul Avery will pick up and try and get you on the show. We're talking again about Chicago 68 and the lessons for today. That number is 312-738-1060. But before we get more into the meat of the program, I'd like to talk about a few upcoming events, because we've got a lot of stuff going on here today. This is not just a history show, okay? So watch your monitor, those of you who are watching on the TV here. And we got, first of all, the Chicago City City Council on trial coming up this Monday at 2 p.m. at the Daley Center. There is going to be an Open Meetings Act trial. The Chicago City Council in May and June of 2016 illegally barred people from the general public attending its meeting. That is a clear violation of the Open Meetings Act. They didn't even, of course, allow public comment. And according to the Illinois Public Meetings Act, any closed meeting is an illegal meeting of a public body such as the City Council, and all final actions taken at such meetings are subject to being revoked. And that's what this trial on Monday is about, whether or not all the decisions of the June 2016 City Council meeting will be hopefully nullified, because they rammed through a $15.8 million TIF subsidy for luxury housing in the Uptown neighborhood, supporting luxury housing literally just about 100 yards away from homeless encampments. It was an insult to everyone in the neighborhood that our alderman, Kappelman, as well as Rahm Emanuel's, rushed through this bill. They did it so as to beat the new requirements of the new Affordable Requirements Ordinance, which said that you'd have to have 20% affordable set-aside housing for TIF-supported projects such as this. They got it under the old one because they rushed it through and they didn't allow any public comment, let alone public attendance. So that's what this trial is. Please show up. Please help bring some transparency to the city of Chicago. We'll get that graphic up in a little bit, but the main thing that we're talking about tonight is the anniversary of the Chicago 68 Democratic Convention under the slogan of Unite Against War and Police Violence. And this is something not just for 68, but it's for today. As you see on your screen there, that is the after effects of a drone bombing in Afghanistan. And in the background, you see the General John Logan statue in Grant Park, which is going to be the terminus of a big protest that's going to be happening at 12 noon Saturday, August 25th, starting at Richard J. Daley Plaza, 50 West Washington Street here in Chicago. So we're going to be talking and bringing those graphics up on the screen a little bit more in a little bit, but back to our conversation with Steve De La Rosa. One of the things about Chicago 1968 is it really underscored the underbelly of Chicago Democratic politics. You had Richard J. Daley, who rammed through on the first ballot support for a pro-war candidate, Hubert Humphrey, even though I believe it's something like 80%, or at least a clear majority of primary voters at the time supported one or another declared anti-war candidate. And so you had literally the thuggery within the convention, with journalists such as Dan Rather and others being beaten up for not showing what Daley wanted to show, but also on the streets of Chicago.
Exactly. It's well, you touched on a couple different things. You touched on the things that we were seeing on TV at the time. Mm-hmm. That is very different from today's media feed of what they share, what the powers that be share with us in our home communities. In '68, the war was broadcast on a daily basis. Mm-hmm. There were body counts day by day. You turn on Channel 2, they give you the body count for the day, because the Army was geared towards producing body counts, because that's what they use to determine how effective they
Are we
were.
winning?
Exactly. And
Yeah,
they,
yeah.
that's,
How many people
that's
they could kill.
Yes, how effective their weaponry was. And that's so different from today because there are so many struggles around the world that occur where lives are being lost. And the lives are from the different countries where the struggles are taking place, as well as American citizens who may be contractors working as mercenaries in different countries. They
Helping
may be-
that out.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not only the continuing U.S. occupations of Afghanistan, which is the longest U.S. war in history by far, but in Iraq, but in Yemen, the U.S.-supported Saudi dictatorship is regularly sending bombing runs over into Yemen, and U.S. planes are refueling those Saudi bombers, and it has led to what has been noted to be the world's worst cholera epidemic in modern history. A completely preventable tragedy is being fomented by not just the current administration, which is totally awful, but also the Obama administration before it. I mean, they have drone bombed more countries, at least 7 now. And we only find out about other countries such as Niger when an American soldier gets killed there. But undoubtedly, it's more than just those 7. I'm going to switch back though to Chicago.
You know,
1968.
the government does a very good job of hiding what's really going on. They do a good job of keeping the deaths of civilians and our own armed forces and mercenaries from public view. Totally different than what it was in '68. And that is a very deliberate act because in '68, and we're talking history again, and we're going there.
Got to learn from it. Got to learn from it.
Got to go there. The daily inundation of death and violence infected our whole culture. It desensitized us from the very beginning, from those years of the reporting on the deaths happening in Vietnam. It began the desensitization of our moral fabric.
It's just body counts. Just
Yes,
body counts.
and it's like, okay, it's like if we
Dehumanization.
hear 150 one week, 180 the next week, and 270 the next week, it's like, who can comprehend that? It's like contemplating $1 billion.
Well, and the other side has learned a lot from that. It took years before we found out that over 10,000 civilians were killed during the U.S. invasion of Panama under, I guess it was the first, I believe it was the first George Bush, or was maybe, that may have been under Reagan, during the Panama invasion. You don't find out about other people's lives. When people are asked how many were killed in Vietnam, the typical thing that most Americans will say is 58,000, ignoring the 3 million Southeast Asians who were murdered and to this day suffer the effects of Agent Orange infestation. I want to get some pictures though up of Chicago '68 on your screen here. Sorry, those of you on Facebook Live, you're not going to be able to see this until you watch it on YouTube. So here's pretty ironically, welcome '68 to the Democrats. See it on your screen there with a whole bevy of cops. That's right. That's where the convention was.
That's where the Rolling Stones were in 1963.
Yeah. And why don't you narrate a few of these pics here? That's in front of, that's Michigan Avenue there with a line
that looks like the Art Institute.
With a whole line of soldiers.
It's amazing how many troops were brought in
I believe it was 27,000, wasn't it?
To buffer the Chicago police force. And I was looking at how the process is for calling up the National Guard, and how all Daley had to do was pick up his phone, call the governor and say, hey, I need more. I need people here. And then these troops came from all over the state, activated to come to Chicago.
And there on your screen there, you'll see the big demonstration right by the John Logan statue And just to the north there is the Hilton Hotel, where a lot of the Democrat conventioneers stayed. This here you see, I'm just narrating for our Facebook Live folk, a whole line of National Guardsmen apparently pointing their weapons at unarmed demonstrators. Again, you can see Michigan Avenue, the line of hotels and so forth in the background there. This again, Michigan Avenue.
Yeah, it's encouraging to note that the makeup of the people that participated in '68 was diverse. I mean, it wasn't overwhelmingly diverse, but it was diverse. People of color realized that they were the ones who were becoming cannon fodder for the war. And it was working people that were going to be expected to go and bear arms because they were the ones who, you know, maybe couldn't get a college deferment or, didn't have a family that's connected somewhere to get them a deferment.
Oh, I've got a bone spur. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Exactly.
Well, and I think it should be underlined that the amount of courage that it took, particularly people of color, to come to these demonstrations is something that's not widely recognized, because not only did you have Daley's shoot to kill order following the assassination of Martin Luther King, but also the CPD, several historical accounts have recounted this, the CPD went around and told black leaders to not participate in these marches, that there were going to be heads cracked, stay away from the convention protests. And of course, people aren't dumb. They know that when there's a crowd where there's going to be heads cracked, the people of color are probably the ones getting the most heads cracked.
Yeah.
And so there was heavy intimidation. We saw that actually in some respects in the run-up to the 2012 NATO conference here in Chicago, where especially Gary McCarthy was basically threatening mayhem by his police, and as we saw at the end of the permitted march, did unleash his police rather than just letting the demonstrators disperse. So this is not just a 1968 issue here.
Yeah, it's complete power. It is a complete display of power to let the working folk know that the police have the ultimate actions that they can pull out of their toolkit to use on people who dissent. And throttling dissent, I think, is their one of their chief aims is to limit dissent. We were talking earlier about the Open Meetings Act. That's a hugely successful tool for fighting municipal machinations that go on each and every day. And the more people use the tools that organizations have built and empowered within Illinois, like the Open Meetings Act, the Freedom of Information Act, two tools that
they're not perfect, but we got to use them. We got to use them.
Yes.
Just for those of you who are watching on Facebook Live, I'll
That's
tell you,
a great picture.
We've got a picture up on the screen here with a Chicago police officer with his hand back here, with a club in hand, just about ready to club a protester
and
or
look
the
how
photographer.
different. Look how different the police looked here in '68 versus how well armed and flak jacketed, helmeted they are nowadays.
And you've got this picture right here. You've got a black journalist whose head is bandaged, and he's got his reporter's notebook out there, and he's interviewing a demonstrator who's got blood streaming down the side of his face. This was Richard J. Daley's cops. This was not an accident that this happened.
Yeah.
This was really showing what the Democratic Party is. We should know, I would hope, about the Republicans, but this is what the Democratic Party is when it comes right down to it.
Yeah, you also have to know too that the police force was no open and welcoming organization back in those days. I mean, it's not. It's more
has more people
integrated.
of color in it now,
Yes,
but
back then,
yeah.
it was pretty much all white.
Yeah, yeah. I'd like to, in the little bit of time left to us, point out what I think are the lessons of 1968, because you can look, I think, at three periods in 20th century U.S. history when there were the biggest gains for working class people, people of color in general. And the three periods I would point to would be the Great Depression, when the rise of the great unions, or your steelworkers union, towards the end of that era. Then you have the early 1960s, the late 50s, when Dr. King and others in the civil rights movement finally ended formal American apartheid. But then you have a little bit of a lull, and then following really 1968 into the early 70s, then you see another rebirth of activism, which got the whole wave of environmental legislation that we take granted for today, the Clean Air, Clean Water Act, affirmative action on a national scale. You had food stamps. You had a winding down of the war on Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos. And all that happened, that latter happened under a very right-wing U.S. president, Richard Nixon. Now, we have got, coming up in a couple of years now, we're going to have another election. And I would hope that people watching our program think that the current occupant of the White House is, frankly, a jackass and a bigot and a narcissist, and wouldn't support him for those and many other reasons. But the Democrats are going to come back and say, hey, we're not him. Support us.
Yeah.
And they are going to try and get away with making as little change as possible. I mean, when Hillary was running, the slogan is basically, I'm qualified.
That's the hallmark of the two corporate parties. It's like, yeah, okay, they're bad, they're worse, we're not so bad, vote for us.
Yeah.
And nothing really changes.
Yeah.
Until people
get into the streets and force the change. And 68 in Chicago was pivotal because a lot of people, especially in the white left, thought, yeah, we can sort of work with LBJ, and then LBJ ends up not running. And then they go with various peace Democrats, so-called,
Kennedy,
who won the
McCarthy.
primaries, but then the Democratic machine shoved the nomination to the pro-war candidate, and then, just to add insult to injury, cracked heads in the streets of Chicago, and a lot of people basically said, these both parties, well, we already know about Tricky Dick Nixon, as we should know about Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And a lot of people said, you know, we've got to do something independent of both these parties. And I think that was the power of that movement for a few years. The power of Dr. King in '63 at the Great March was not the rhetoric, but because he refused to sign up with either party. Same with the union movement in the best years of the Great Depression in terms of their fightbacks. They refused to sign up with either party. And once they did sign up, the movements went south.
Yeah, that's when their power was cut.
Yeah.
You're right.
And so it's really, that is the power, that is what is so important, is painful in many respects as the Chicago '68 convention was, with people being hurt, the war continuing in Vietnam, and millions being slaughtered. It led to a revolution in consciousness, and while it only lasted a few years, it did force Nixon out of Vietnam. It forced.
It sparked a lot of seeds. It sparked a lot of thought, even though people may not have sprung up and gotten totally active. They absorbed what was going on and observed what was happening in communities. And I think use that to try and create some kind of strategy within their own minds to be able to survive. Because it's like today, there's so much happening that you don't know which way to turn.
Well, in many respects, as pointed out in our call, things are worse we have a mass incarceration rate which is more than 4 times that of what it was in 1968. Well, there was a war on Southeast Asia and it was a hot war with U.S. troops on the ground. Today we're doing it with drone bombs, and it's 7+ countries. The standard of living for American workers is far less than it was in 1968, where real wages have been declining since about 1974 on average. And so we're in a real pickle.
Yes, we are.
And the fat on the system of the United States having so much more than any other country, now the United States is a relatively declining power. And so it's going to fight for its share of the profits versus you, me, and millions of other people out there.
I think you made some excellent points in terms of all of us who are working in and about the system. I mean, you cannot exist without interacting with the system. But everybody has to get to that point where they say, okay, I'm not going to do this again. I'm not going to
do something different so we can actually get the gains we want.
Yes.
We saw those gains in those 3 eras that I talked about. Unfortunately, we're going to have to be wrapping this up, but before we do...
Can we take another half hour?
We're going to be arrested for trespassing here in the studio if we do, Steve. But we'll be taking up this topic again. I'd like to, just before we close out the show, though, bring back a few important announcements here up on your screen here. Sorry, Facebook Live folk. The Chicago City Council on trial this coming Monday, 2 p.m. at the Richard Daley Center. That's on the north side of the plaza in courtroom 2405. Then the big event that we've been talking about tonight, Chicago 1968 and 2018, 50 years later. That's the John Logan statue in Grant Park right here on your screen. Unite Against War and Police Violence, Saturday, August 25th, 12 noon, beginning at the Richard J. Daley Plaza, appropriately enough. And we'll get that up on your screen there. Yes, Richard J. Daley Plaza at 12 noon, Saturday, August 25th.
Get it into your calendars.
Get it in your calendar. And with that, again, I'd like to thank Steve De La Rosa for helping us out in today's show, as well as Paul Avery in our booth. I apologize, we did get a caller right there at the tail end of the show, but as I said, we'd be arrested for trespassing if we stayed in the studio here longer. Thank you again, Chicago Access Network Television, for letting our voice here hit the airwaves.